You ever feel that cold knot in your stomach? The kind that makes your hands tremble even when you know you've done nothing wrong. That's exactly what I felt the day two men in police uniforms knocked on my front door. My wife was in the kitchen humming softly as she set the table for dinner, while my teenage daughter sat cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through her phone. It should have been a normal evening, but instead, the moment I saw the badges and stern faces, I felt that strange ripple in the air, the kind that tells you something isn't right. And I was right. Because little did they know, I wasn't just any man in this quiet neighborhood. I was the chief of police. When I opened the door, one of them barked my name as though I were some criminal they'd been chasing for months. He flashed his badge quickly, too quickly for anyone with training to miss the subtle details. My heart tightened, but my training kicked in. I kept my face neutral, like an ordinary man suddenly confronted with authority. My wife peeked from the kitchen, her hands frozen in midair as the men demanded that I step outside immediately. My daughter looked up from the couch, fear widening her eyes. That's when I knew this wasn't just some misunderstanding. This was an attack, sir. You're under arrest for violating Neighborhood Code 5A12, one of them said. His tone was rough, his posture all wrong. No real officer would phrase it that way. My suspicion deepened when the other guy shoved a folded paper into my chest, claiming it was a warrant. The document was laughable. Just a printed sheet with bold words at the top. No seal, no signatures. Nothing legal about it. But my wife didn't see that. She only saw two uniforms at our door, threatening to take her husband away. Her face turned pale, and my daughter whispered, "Dad, what's happening?" Forced myself to play along, my mind racing. If these men were bold enough to impersonate officers, then they weren't acting alone. No, this had the HOA written all over it. For months, Karen, the head of the HOA, had been on a mission to tear me down. It started with little things. Petty fines for my daughter's bike being left on the driveway. Warnings about my mailbox being the wrong shade of black. Then it escalated. Letters filled with threats. HOA meetings where my name was dragged through the mud. I ignored most of it. I had bigger battles to fight in the real world, but Karen hated that I wouldn't bend to her. She hated that she couldn't control me. And now, this stunt, sending imposters to my door, proved just how far she was willing to go. "Dad, don't go with them," my daughter pleaded, her voice breaking. I glanced at her, then at my wife, who looked like she was about to faint. I gave them the smallest nod, a silent message that everything would be okay. Then I turned back to the imposters. "All right," I said calmly. "Give me just a second to grab my shoes." They smirked, believing they had me. But as I turned away, my hand brushed against the small drawer near the entryway where I kept my badge and service weapon. My pulse quickened, not out of fear, but out of anger. Inside my head, I replayed the last few months. The humiliation Karen tried to cause my family. The way she once mocked my wife at a neighborhood event, calling her the woman with a husband, too busy playing cop to mow his lawn. The time she stood outside my home, snapping pictures, threatening to report us for having guests. Each memory burned hotter, stoking the fire in my chest. And now she had dared to send fakes to my door, right in front of my family. That wasn't just petty revenge anymore. That was war. I slipped my badge into my pocket and turned back around. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice steady, "before we go, I need to see your credentials again, just protocol." Their expressions faltered. One of them shifted uncomfortably, and the other scowled. "We already showed you," he snapped. But I didn't flinch. I let my voice drop lower, colder. "Show me again." The tension thickened. My wife gripped the kitchen counter, her knuckles white. My daughter clutched a pillow, her lip trembling. And then it happened. The imposter pulled out his fake badge again. Sloppy, plastic, cheap. That's when I reached into my pocket, pulled out my real badge, and held it high. "You boys picked the wrong house," I said, every word cutting through the silence. Because I'm the chief of police, their faces drained of color. One of them stuttered, trying to recover, but it was too late. I had already drawn my weapon, not pointing it yet, just letting the weight of authority hang in the air. "Now," I said, "you're going to tell me exactly who sent you here, or you're not walking away from this porch as free men." My wife gasped. My daughter whispered, "Oh my God." And the imposters froze, realizing the trap they had walked into. In that moment, I wasn't just defending my family. I was preparing to dismantle the HOA from the inside out. Piece by piece, and I knew exactly where I was going to start. The next day felt heavier than usual. The sun rose, but instead of warmth, I felt a chill crawl down my spine as I stared out my kitchen window at the quiet neighborhood. On the surface, everything looked calm. Birds hopped across the grass. A kid pedaled by on his bike, but I knew what had happened the night before was anything but normal. The fake officers, the attempt to humiliate me in front of my family. It wasn't just a power move, it was war. And the HOA had just crossed the line into a battlefield they didn't understand. When I sat down at the breakfast table, my wife, Sarah, set a cup of coffee in front of me. Her hand lingered on my shoulder, her voice steady but strained. "We can't just ignore this anymore," she whispered. Her eyes, usually so full of peace, now carried exhaustion. "They're making our lives miserable, and now they're pretending to send cops to our house." She shook her head. "It's dangerous. What if the kids had answered the door?" Her words pierced me deeper than she realized. She was right. My daughter Emily was only 16, and my son Ryan just 13. They didn't deserve to grow up with fear because of some power-hungry neighbors playing God with HOA rules. I clenched my fists under the table, hiding the storm inside me. "I won't let them touch this family again," I said finally. "If they want to fight, they're about to learn what it means to pick one with the wrong man." That morning, instead of heading straight to the precinct, I made a detour. I drove past the HOA clubhouse. It was a smug-looking building, all brick and glass, standing at the entrance of the neighborhood like a crown jewel. From the outside, you'd never guess the kind of corruption hiding inside those walls. As I slowed my car, I spotted Karenth, HOA president herself, standing with two board members. They laughed about something, sipping coffee like they had no care in the world. But when her eyes met mine, her smile faltered. She knew I had seen through her little game. And in that instant, a silent war declaration passed between us. At work, my deputies were buzzing about the incident. "Chief, you serious? Someone actually tried to pose as law enforcement at your house," one asked, shaking his head. "Suicide. Whoever's behind this, better pray we don't catch them." I didn't say much. Instead, I reviewed the precinct's surveillance reports. Sure enough, a neighbor's camera had picked up the two imposters arriving in an SUV late at night. Their uniforms were cheap replicas, their badges laughable. But the intent was deadly serious. They wanted to strip me of my authority, to make me look powerless in my own home. When I returned home that evening, Emily sat at the dining table, her eyes red from tears. She looked up at me, voice trembling. "Dad, why? Do they hate us so much? We just live here. We didn't do anything wrong." That broke me more than any staged arrest ever could. No father wants to see his children cry because of neighbors who think they hold power over lives. I hugged her tightly, whispering into her hair, "This ends soon, I promise. They'll never scare us again." Sarah watched from the doorway, her face unreadable. But later, when the kids had gone upstairs, she finally spoke the truth, weighing on her. "They're trying to push us out, Daniel. They want to break us." She set her hand on mine, her voice firmer than I'd heard in weeks. "Don't just defend us this time. Make them pay." Her words lit a fire in me. She was right again. Defense wasn't enough anymore. They had attacked my family, my home, my honor. Now it was my turn. And unlike them, I didn't need fake uniforms or childish games. I had the law, I had power. And more importantly, I had patience. The next weekend, the HOA held their monthly meeting. Every homeowner was invited, but usually only a few showed up. I knew Karen would be there, flaunting her authority, bragging about fines and petty rules. This time, though, I decided to show up too. Not as Daniel, the quiet neighbor. Not even as Daniel, the father and husband. I walked in as Chief Daniel. Right, the man who had sworn to protect justice. The room went silent when I entered. Karen's smirk flickered, replaced by a twitch of unease. "Chief Wright," she said mockingly. "What an honor. To what do we owe the pleasure?" I didn't sit. I didn't smile. Instead, I laid a folder on the table. "To remind this board," I said slowly, "that impersonating an officer is a felony. And anyone connected to such a crime will face the full weight of the law." My voice cut through the room like a blade. Karen tried to laugh it off, but her eyes darted nervously. "Impersonating officers? What are you talking about? We don't know anything about that." I leaned in closer, my gaze locked on hers. "Then you'd better pray the evidence doesn't lead back to this board." The room shifted with tension. Some board members looked away. Others shifted in their seats. The air was heavy, thick with guilt. And for the first time, I saw fear in Karen's eyes. But what she didn't know was this. I wasn't just going to scare them. I was going to expose them, piece by piece, lie by lie. And when it was over, this HOA would crumble to ashes. That night, as I tucked my kids into bed, Ryan looked up at me. "You're gonna beat them, right, Dad?" I smiled. Though my heart was hard. "Son, they already lost. They just don't know it yet." The war had officially begun. The morning after the humiliating confrontation, word spread across the community like wildfire. Neighbors whispered on their porches, glancing my way as I walked to my truck. Some eyes carried sympathy, others fear, and a few, the ones loyal to Karen's, parked with contempt. It wasn't the silence that bothered me, but the way my children now had to hear classmates repeat stories twisted out of truth. My daughter asked if I was really going to jail. My son, too young to understand politics or vendettas, just clung to my side as if I might disappear any second. The HOA hadn't just attacked me. They had taken aim at my family's peace, and that, I decided, was a mistake I could never forgive. I spent that afternoon sitting in my office, staring at the folder of evidence I had gathered. Reports of trespassing, theft, financial mismanagement, even recordings of Karen threatening residents, all documented, neatly stacked, but unused. I hadn't pulled the trigger yet, hoping the HOA would back down if I showed restraint. But restraint had only emboldened them. They thought sending fake officers would intimidate me. They thought dragging my name through the mud would make me crumble. They thought wrong. My badge wasn't just a symbol of authority, 'twas a shield. And I was prepared to wield it in ways they hadn't imagined. That evening, I drove out to the lake. It was my place of calm, where my late wife and I had spent countless evenings watching the sunset. The water reflected the fiery sky, peaceful and untouched, but my chest burned with the storm inside. Standing at the shoreline, I made a silent promise. This wouldn't just be about revenge, would be about justice. For me, for my children, and for every neighbor Karen had tormented. I would expose her schemes. and I wouldn't stop until the HOA collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. The first step was subtle. I called a meeting at the station with a few trusted deputies. I laid out what had happened, including the attempted arrest. Their faces hardened, jaws tightening as they realized the HOA had crossed a line from harassment into criminal conspiracy. We planned to dig deeper into Karen's financials, her communications, even her allies on the board. This isn't personal, I told them, though my clenched fists betrayed the truth. This is about protecting the community from someone who believes she's untouchable. The real turning point came when a neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, knocked on my door late that night. Her hands trembled as she handed me a USB drive. She had been part of the HOA's inner circle once, trusted by Karen, but she'd grown tired of the bullying. The drive contained recordings of private meetings, discussions about manipulating fines, fabricating violations, and most damning of all, Karen laughing as she boasted about the fake officer stunt. She said it would ruin you, Mrs. Alvarez, whispered, tears welling in her eyes. But I can't stay silent anymore. I thanked her, though inside I was torn between rage and grim satisfaction. That file was the weapon I needed, but I knew unleashing it too soon would make Karen retreat into a corner. I wanted her exposed fully, publicly, with no escape. So I held back, planning the perfect strike. I knew she would come after me again. People like her couldn't resist pressing further. All I had to do was let her dig her own grave, and when the time was right, I would lower the rope. The following week, my prediction came true. A notice was taped to my door, bright red with bold letters. HOA board hearing, mandatory attendance. They were summoning me like a criminal, demanding I appear before their self-appointed counsel to answer for violations. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. They wanted a spectacle, to humiliate me in front of the neighborhood, to prove they still held control. What they didn't know was that every step they took made my case stronger. Every threat, every fake document, every misuse of power. All added weight to the chains they were forging for themselves. The night before the hearing, I sat with my children at the kitchen table. My daughter asked if everything was going to be okay. I smiled, though it hurt, and told her the truth. It's going to be better than okay. We're going to make sure people like Karen never scare anyone here again. She looked at me with a mix of fear and pride, and I knew I couldn't fail them. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about showing my kids what it meant to fight back. Not with cruelty, but with courage and justice. When I finally closed my eyes that night, I dreamt not of fear, but of victory. The HOA thought they had written the script of my downfall. What they didn't know was that I was already rewriting the ending, one page at a time. The days that followed were unlike anything I had ever experienced. The HOA board had gone silent, but not because they'd given up. No, their silence felt more like a storm cloud hanging above the neighborhood. Building and building until the lightning struck. Everywhere I went, I could sense their eyes on me. Neighbors whispered when I passed, some offering sympathetic nods, while others, those loyal to the HO, looked at me with bitterness, as though I were the villain disrupting their perfect world. What they didn't realize was how much darker the HOA's lies ran, and how far they were willing to go to protect themselves from exposure. One evening, while sitting at the kitchen table with my wife, Emily, and my son, Daniel, I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me. Emily's hand rested on mine, her touch grounding me, even as my mind reeled with plans and possibilities. "They'll come back," she said quietly. "People like them don't just stop. They'll push until they either win or destroy themselves in the process." Daniel, still young but sharp for his age, looked at me with wide eyes. "Dad, why don't you just arrest them?" he asked innocently. His words hit me harder than any threat. If only it were that simple. Yes, I had authority as the chief of police, but I also had to walk carefully if I overstepped. The HOA would twist it into a narrative that made me the abuser of power. I couldn't give them that weapon. The next morning, I woke to find a letter pinned to my front door. No envelope, no return name. Just a piece of paper with 3 chilling words scrawled in red marker. Back off now. It wasn't signed. But I didn't need a name to know where it came from. Emily read it over my shoulder and gasped. "They're threatening us now," she whispered. I folded the paper carefully, sliding it into a folder. I had started keeping one dedicated to every action, every threat, every scrap of evidence against the HOA. If they thought intimidation would scare me, they had gravely underestimated the resolve of a man with everything to lose. Later that day, I made a discreet visit to the station. I trusted my officers, but I also knew the HOA might try to sway some of them. I called in only the most loyal and honest members of my team, people who had proven their integrity time and time again. In the briefing room, I laid out what I had discovered so far: the fake officers, the intimidation, the threats. The room was heavy with tension as I spoke, every word sinking into the air like stones in water. When I finished, one of my most trusted sergeants, Ramirez, leaned forward and asked, "Chief, do you want us to go after them now?" I shook my head. "Not yet. They're clever. If we move too soon, they'll find a way to spin it. We need them to expose themselves fully. When they do, there'll be no room for excuses." But as the week wore on, their tactics grew bolder. One night, I was patrolling the streets of our quiet community when I noticed headlights trailing me. At first, I thought little of it. People often came and went at odd hours, but after 3 turns and 2 dead-end roads, the car was still behind me. I pulled over abruptly, forcing them to pass. Instead, the car stopped. The windows rolled down just enough for me to see 2 figures inside, their faces masked by shadows. "Back off," one of them called out before the car sped away into the night. I stood there, the cool air brushing against my skin, my anger simmering just below the surface. They were getting desperate. Desperation always led to mistakes. At home, Emily tried to hide her fear, but I could see it in her eyes every time the phone rang or a car slowed near our house. "This isn't just about you anymore," she said one night, her voice breaking. "They're dragging us into it too. What if something happens to Daniel?" Her words cut deep, deeper than any threat the HOA could send. For the first time in years, I questioned if I had made the right decision moving us into this neighborhood. We wanted peace, community, a safe place to raise our son. Instead, we found ourselves trapped in a war. But I also knew backing down wasn't an option. If I allowed them to keep control through fear, what would that teach my son about courage, about justice? So I began planning, not rashly, not with anger leading the way, but with precision. I would gather everything I needed, proof of their impersonation, recordings of their threats, financial records that showed how far their corruption went. And when the time was right, I wouldn't just bring them down in front of the neighborhood. I would bring them down in front of the law. One afternoon, while reviewing some HOA records I had managed to obtain through a sympathetic neighbor, I discovered something that nearly stopped my heart. The HOA wasn't just faking officers. They were funneling money, our money, the community's money, into shadow accounts. Thousands of dollars had vanished into what they labeled maintenance fees and security improvements. But the money was nowhere to be found in actual services. It was theft, plain and simple. The kind of theft that could land them in prison for years. And I had the first piece of evidence in my hands. That night, I tucked Daniel into bed and promised him that everything would be okay, even as the weight of the fight ahead bore down on me. As I kissed him goodnight, he looked at me and asked, "Softly, you'll keep us safe, right, Dad?" My throat tightened. "Always," I said, "no matter what." The truth was, the war with the HOA was only just beginning, and I knew they would come harder than ever before. But for the first time, I felt the balance shifting. Their lies, their threats, their fake officers, it was all catching up to them. And soon, the world would see them for what they truly were. The silence in my home that night was heavy. Laura sat across from me at the dining table, her hands folded tightly, her eyes locked on mine. "Michael," she said softly, "they're not going to stop. People like that don't stop unless someone makes them." She wasn't afraid anymore. I could hear the conviction in her voice. The kind of determination that comes after you've been wronged so deeply that fear simply burns away. I reached across the table and took her hands, nodding. "Then we finish this," I told her. "But we're going to do it right. No mistakes." The very next morning, I called in a favor from the district attorney's office. For weeks, I'd been gathering evidence, building a file thicker than a phone book. Every fake citation, every threat, every dollar they extorted from innocent homeowners was documented. Now it was time to escalate. The DA agreed to review the evidence, and by the afternoon, I received the call. "This is enough to move forward. But you'll need to make a public arrest to send the right message." That sentence stuck with me. Public. They wanted this humiliation to be undeniable. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying the night those fake officers stormed onto my porch, trying to handcuff me like I was some criminal. The humiliation, the insult to my badge, the fear in Laura's eyes, all of it churned inside me like a storm waiting to break. I wasn't just a man anymore. I was a husband, a protector, and the chief of police who'd been pushed far too far. When morning came, I put on my uniform. I polished my badge until it gleamed. Laura stood at the doorway watching me, her eyes shining with both pride and worry. "Be careful," she whispered. I gave her a small smile, kissed her forehead, and told her I'll be back before dinner. But inside, I knew this wasn't going to be simple. This was going to change everything in our neighborhood forever. By noon, I had my entire team gathered in the station. Not rookies, not people who didn't understand. These were my most trusted officers. Men and women I'd trained, fought beside, and relied on for years. I laid everything out on the table. The forged HOA documents, the fake officer IDs, the recorded threats, and the financial trail that led straight to Karen and her inner circle. "They thought they were untouchable," I said, my voice steady but sharp. "Today, we remind them exactly who upholds the law in this county." Heads nodded, jaws clenched. The room was filled with a quiet, righteous fury. We moved just before sunset. The timing was deliberate. Families were walking dogs, kids were playing in the yards, and Karen was hosting one of her smug little HOA gatherings at the clubhouse. The perfect stage. My convoy of marked police SUVs rolled down the street. In formation. Doors opened, boots hit the pavement. And neighbors froze in stunned silence as nearly a dozen officers spread out with precision. Karen's laughter carried across the parking lot as she toasted with a glass of wine. But when she saw me step out of my vehicle in full uniform, her smile faltered. The moment her eyes locked onto mine, I saw a flicker of something I hadn't seen before. Certainty. Not fear. Not yet. Just doubt. "Michael," she sneered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "you can't intimidate me with your costume. You don't control this community." I didn't say a word. Instead, I lifted the arrest warrant high in the air and let my officers surround the clubhouse. One by one, the papers were read aloud. Fraud, forgery, impersonating law enforcement, embezzlement, extortion. The list went on. Each word a hammer blow against the false sense of power she had built. Gasps rippled through the crowd of neighbors. Some people stepped back. Others whispered, And then it happened. Karen's smirk crumbled into a shaky laugh. "You're bluffing," she said, her voice trembling. "You can't do this. I own this neighborhood." That was when I stepped forward, my badge catching the last rays of the sun. "No, Karen," I said, my voice calm but sharp enough too. "Cut. You don't own anything. You broke the law, and tonight you answer for it." I nodded to my sergeant. The cuffs clicked open. The crowd went completely still. Karen started thrashing as the officers took her by the arms. Her glass of wine shattered against the pavement. "This is illegal," she shrieked. "I'll have your badge for this. My lawyers will bury you." But the sound of her voice was drowned out by the neighbors pulling out their phones, recording. Every second, the very people she had terrorized for years were now witnesses to her downfall. And for the first time in a long time, I saw relief in their faces. Relief and hope. As she was dragged past me, she locked eyes with me one last time. Spitting venom in her words, "This isn't over." I leaned in just enough for her to hear and whispered, "It already is." The cuffs clicked shut, and the sound was the sweetest music I'd ever heard. That night, Kai drove home to Laura, exhausted but alive with a fire inside me. We sat together on the porch, watching the quiet street. For the first time in months, it felt like peace was possible again. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't finished. People like her never surrender quietly. And while I had won this battle, the war she had started was far from over. The day after the arrests, the neighborhood was hushed in a way I had never felt before. It wasn't the usual quiet of dawn, when the lake shimmered and the air was filled with birdsong. No, this was the heavy silence of shame, of secrets dragged into the open. People avoided eye contact, doors stayed shut longer, and whispers traveled faster than footsteps. I could feel the tension in every breath, as though the very ground of the neighborhood was trembling with the fallout of truth. The HOA board had been exposed as liars, frauds, and manipulators. And yet, I knew this wasn't over. There was still one final reckoning waiting for them. The city council meeting was scheduled for that evening. And I had already filed a full report. Fraud, impersonation of officers, attempted kidnapping, all of it, laid bare in black and white. I had spent the night compiling every detail, every statement, and every piece of evidence my department had uncovered. The council was the ultimate authority that granted the HOA its power, and tonight their fate would be decided. As chief of police, I would not only present the evidence, but also stand as a witness to their disgrace. Before I left for work, Sarah came into my study holding 2 cups of coffee. Her face looked tired but determined, and when she set the mug beside me, I could see that same quiet fire in her eyes that I had fallen in love with years ago. "You're doing the right thing," she said softly, "but just promise me you'll come back home safe after this. No more surprises, no more traps." I nodded, though my chest tightened with the weight of her words. "I promise," I said, reaching for her hand. "This ends tonight, for good." At the station, I briefed my officers, preparing them for the chaos that might unfold at the council meeting. HOA members, especially those like Karen, were unpredictable when cornered. And tonight, they were about to lose everything: their authority, their reputation, and their control over the community. We had to be ready for anything. The council chamber was packed when I arrived that evening. Residents had come in droves, filling every seat and spilling into the aisles. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, a blend of fear, anger, and hope. Some people looked at me with gratitude, others with unease, but all eyes turned to the front when the council chair banged the gavel to call the meeting to order. Karen sat near the front, dressed in an expensive blazer, her hair perfect as ever, but her face betrayed the tension underneath. She tried to hold herself with the same arrogance she always did, but I could see the cracks forming. Beside her sat a few board members, pale and tight-lipped, their hands fidgeting in their laps. They knew what was coming. When my name was called, I stood, my uniform crisp under the chamber lights. I carried a folder thick with documents, but it wasn't just the paperwork that spoke for me. It was the truth, carried in my voice and in the eyes of those who had suffered under Karen's rule. I began with the facts. This past week, members of the HOA board, under the direction of Karen Reynolds, engaged in an elaborate scheme to impersonate law enforcement officers. Their goal was to intimidate me, your chief of police, and to secure power over residents by force. They falsified documents, staged an attempted arrest, and conspired to defraud the very community they swore to protect. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, outrage mixing with shock. I continued, laying out the evidence one piece at a time: the fake badges, the intercepted emails, the testimony of residents who had been threatened before. With every page turned, the walls around Karen's empire crumbled further. Karen tried to interrupt, her voice sharp and indignant. "This is ridiculous. He's twisting the truth because he has a personal vendetta against me." None of this. The council chair cut her off with a stern glare. "Mrs. Reynolds, you will have your turn to speak." When she sat down, I looked directly at the residents. "Many of you have been fined unfairly, threatened, and manipulated. I've spoken to families forced to sell their homes because of outrageous penalties, to parents harassed for letting their children play in their own yards. This is not what a community should feel like. This is not justice. Tonight, you have the chance to take that back." The room erupted in applause, loud enough to shake the walls. For the first time, I saw hope in their faces instead of fear. It struck me in the chest like a hammer, the realization that this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about healing a community that had been broken for too long. Karen stood. When it was her turn, her words laced with venom. She painted herself as a victim, claimed that I had orchestrated everything to discredit her, even accused me of abusing my position as chief. But her voice cracked, her hands trembled, and no amount of performance could erase the mountain of evidence piled against her. When the council returned from deliberation, the chamber went silent again. The chair spoke slowly, clearly. "Evidence presented tonight leaves no room for doubt. The actions of the HOA board were fraudulent, dangerous, and abusive. Effective immediately, this HOA is dissolved. All pending fines are null and void. Further, this case will be referred to the district attorney for criminal prosecution." The chamber exploded with cheers. Some residents cried, hugging each other, while others shouted in relief. Karen's face drained of color as officers stepped forward to escort her out, not my officers, but state marshals who had been waiting quietly in the back. She screamed, threatened lawsuits, promised revenge. But her words were drowned out by the roar of victory around her. As I stood there, watching her being led away, Sarah's words echoed in my mind. No more surprises, no more traps. It was over, truly over. The weight I had carried for months, maybe years, lifted from my shoulders. Walking out of that chamber, I felt the cool night air wash over me. The stars shimmered above, and for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt like home again. My home. The HOA thought they had played their last card, but they had no idea that the real game had only just begun. That night, I sat in my office with a heavy silence around me, the weight of everything pressing down on my shoulders. My family had suffered sleepless nights, whispered conversations, and endless fear because of these people. I could see the exhaustion in Emily's eyes and the quiet hurt in my son's face when he asked why people hated us so much. The answer burned inside me, and I knew I couldn't let it go unanswered. Justice wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every single family in this neighborhood who had been bullied, manipulated, and controlled. It was about ending the cycle. I gathered everything. Every recording of the fake arrests, every piece of evidence of illegal bribes, every email they had carelessly sent. My desk was covered in files and photographs. The truth spread out in front of me like a map of their downfall. It felt almost surreal, holding their fate in my hands, but I wasn't trembling. Not anymore. I called the district attorney personally. When he heard the evidence, his tone shifted from skepticism to cold determination. "Bring it in tomorrow," he said. "We'll take it from here. And Chief, you did good." That was the first time in months I felt the crushing weight begin to lift. The next morning, I drove down to the courthouse. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the streets in shades of orange and red. The world felt alive again. People were walking their dogs, kids were riding bikes, and for the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider in my own town. I carried the box of evidence in my arms like it was sacred, because, in a way, it was. It wasn't just paper, it was freedom, healing, and vengeance tied together. The arrests came fast. By noon, squad cars filled the HOA's offices. I stood across the street, arms folded, watching as Karen and the rest of her board members were led out in handcuffs. Karen screamed, her face twisted in rage, but her words were empty now. She yelled about conspiracies, about how she was being framed, about how I had manipulated everyone. But the neighbors didn't buy it anymore. I stood on porches, leaning over fences, some even cheering as the so-called rulers of their community were exposed as criminals. One woman clapped slowly, tears streaming down her face, whispering, "Finally." Karen caught my eye as they pushed her into the back of a squad car. For the first time, she looked small. Not powerful, not untouchable. Just a frightened woman who realized her empire had collapsed. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The silence between us was enough to tell her everything. Her reign was over. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to breathe again. Families who had lived in fear started reclaiming their homes and yards. Children played by the lake without being chased off. Neighbors gathered to share meals and laughter, no longer worried about fines or threats. The HOA was dissolved permanently, stripped of every ounce of authority. For the first time, people felt like they truly owned their lives here. At home, Emily hugged me tightly, tears in her eyes. "It's over," she whispered, her voice shaking. Our son ran into the room, holding up a drawing he made of me in uniform, a big smile on his face. "You're my hero," he said proudly. That moment cut deeper than any revenge could. I realized then it was never really about vengeance. It was about protecting the people I loved and proving that no bully, no matter how powerful they think they are, can crush what's right. Months later, I walked down to the lake at sunset. The water rippled peacefully, reflecting the sky's colors like a painting. This lake, once at the center of their greed and lies, now belonged to the people. Again, I sat on the dock, breathing in the calm air, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The kind of peace that comes not from winning, but from surviving. From fighting through the storm and finally seeing the light on the other side. The HOA had tried to break me with fear. But they forgot one simple truth. You cannot arrest justice. And you cannot silence truth. I was the chief of police, yes, but more importantly, I was a father, a husband, and a man who refused to bend. And that was the one thing they could never take away from me.